All right, good morning. Welcome back to BMC Exchange. I'm John Powers, Vice President of Federal U.S. Enterprise at BMC today. And today we're going to have a panel discussion on the topic of centralized autonomy in the federal enterprise. I'm joined by three subject matter expert panelists. Let me take a minute here and introduce them. We'll start with Sean Fromm from G2SF. G2SF, a little bit about them. Niche provider, focusing on the integration of enterprise technologies to meet customer mission requirements with specific federal domain expertise in cybersecurity, IT service management, and mobility. Mr. Fromm is co-founder and vice president responsible for strategic growth and service delivery. Next is Bob Mosley from G2IT. G2IT leads organizations to define strategies and transform their service management portfolio. Main charter is to focus on improving maturity, capability, and automation to drive adoption and management of seamless services. Bob leads this effort as Director of Strategy and Services of G2IT. Welcome, Bob. And last but not least, Vinny Lima from VVL. VVL Systems and Consulting is a 8A small business focusing on IT optimization through product services for cloud, infrastructure, and end user capabilities. VVL is a BMC Elite partner providing a spectrum of product and services for both federal and commercial clients. Vinny is the managing director for VVL. So thank you, Vinny, and to Bob and Sean, thank you for joining us here today. So as I mentioned at the start, right, we're going to be talking about centralized autonomy in the federal enterprise, and this is not necessarily an industry-wide term. So why don't we take a minute or two and just, and we'll start with you, Sean, in terms of defining what it is. So let's talk about that a little bit, and why don't we start with you, Sean, and talk about what it means to G2SF.
Thanks, John. Good morning, and thanks for having me and hosting this panel. So centralized autonomy, right? It's not a commonplace term. It's something about 5.5 years ago. We were struggling in how to explain to a customer at the way they should be looking to deliver their enterprise services. We're a large organization, and had a CIO shop that was delivering a series of services, and then there were organizations or commands, if you will, similar to bureaus that were perhaps a little bit further away, from the flagpole, different mission sets, different IT requirements, yet fundamentally really had the same base requirements in terms of services. And so we came up with this term of centralized autonomy. It's a little bit contradictory or oxymoronical in terms of we were trying to articulate the fact that you could have a series of defined centralized services that actually could vary based on mission requirements for those commands or bureaus, if you will. So that was the autonomous concept, right? Where they could decide perhaps how they implemented, how they executed their processes, how they configured certain things, and yet there were certain defined parameters that were pushed out by the central IT organization. In this case, it was the CIO shop. So that's essentially where we came up with the term and why, we were trying to solve the way to articulate that message, to the customer.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, we're not, it sounds like as we delve into this isn't just a technology discussion, but it sounds like this is getting people on the same page, same sheet of music, defining their swim lanes and what those kind of are. So, Vinny, what is this? This is, like I said, and we just talked about this isn't necessarily an industry-wide term, but how does VVL view this?
Yeah, John, first and foremost, thank you for having us here for this panel. And Sean is absolutely right. Centralized autonomy, in our perspective, has been a maturity model that's been happening, in the federal space. And the way that we see how is it defined is the ability for especially federated agencies that have a variety of organizations under a single umbrella to be allowed to explore technologies, especially in the day of the cloud, of AI, and a lot of leading edge technologies that are changing, adapting all the time on a daily basis. It's allowing them to explore and to also define and model the enterprise processes to what works best for them within a set of parameters, as Sean mentioned, and really yield a set of capabilities that are going to be best suited for their mission, but still aligning to a strategic vision, a strategic goal, and as I usually say, is a set of controls or bumper guards to make sure that cost, risk, and benefits are realized and shared across these multiple entities under a single umbrella.
Right. So, I mean, as we talk about this, it seems almost like we're talking about culture almost quite a bit, right? In terms of everything from, people to process to technology, what they want to be. So, Bob, lastly to you is how does this make sense to G2IT?
Yes, thank you, John. See really is an organizational or transformational shift as you move from the autonomy of doing everything yourself and having the capability of making your own decisions. That results in different solutions, different processes, different technologies. And then we see as you move to a shared service, the transition really affects the organization, the people, and the process. So while it is a technology problem under the covers, you have to understand how's the organization affected, how are we migrating, how are our processes change, and help people understand how the change will affect them, how they will implement it, and how they will deploy new technology, because with your legacy systems, you need to be moving towards the cloud and other areas of new technology. At the same time, you're considering these organizations.
Great. All right, so now that we've essentially defined what it is a little bit, let's talk. I mean, Vinny, and as we look at what are the real benefits to doing it, right? Why is it something that's worth pursuing? So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, John. So, the real challenge is, there's process technology, right, and there's people. But as technology evolves so fast, having a centralized mandate really poses challenges for some of these agencies, right? For having the freedom for true autonomy for what they need to do within their mission space, as often those directives do not provide the flexibility that's often needed, right? And that need changes, right? Every office or agency is going to have a mission that changes with time. And so the ability to have the challenge of having a centralized mandate, it's counter to the mission directives that they have to deliver on a day-to-day basis, right? Now, the opposite is that when there's no centralized direction or mission, often agencies are counter to the benefits for the greater good, and as well as they don't take advantage of cost, consolidation, or the taxpayer benefits. And even more, ability for different organizations to learn from each other. If they're going through their own mission and they end up putting a barrier to sharing the benefits and the lessons learned. So, for example, when we worked with USDA for their multi-cloud and hybrid cloud capability, the focus was on a centralized, secure capability that met a set of regulatory standards, such as FedRAMP. But what we found once we had the capability that was offered by OCIO, and we started talking to individual agencies, each agency has a specific niche and need or specific capabilities out of that cloud offering that needed to be adapted, because some agencies were more mature than others. Some had applications that were already optimized for the cloud, some did not. And so working with the OCIO, we were able to define, as I mentioned before, the bumper guards when using cloud in alignment with their corporate standards.
No, it makes perfect sense, and I love the proof point. So, Bob, in looking at G2IT has been working the federal space for quite some time. when you look at everything that G2IT has done within the space, what are your view of those benefits, right? Are those outside of what Vinny just described, or in addition to?
Yes, what we see where agencies are trying to do a shared service is really they're trying to leverage the new capabilities and maximize their spend on the common solutions in the uniqueness of each area. So really the collaboration improvement, the information exchange, we're trying to empower each agency to use its own information the way they need to see fit for their local processes, yet have the commonality of the common process. And really when we do that, when you balance the two, you get the best solution.
That's interesting. I think how many organizations we look at and work with that sometimes the right hand's not talking to the left, and that collaboration is a tough thing to achieve. So Sean, any final thoughts on the benefits there?
Yeah, sure. I think at the highest level, you kind of hit it on the head there, John. It's going to encourage and facilitate collaboration. A degree of standardization that inherently is going to reduce risk. As we kind of think about the evolution of the way things have gone, and let's just say the last 20 years in the federal space, as Vinny said earlier, technology has phenomenally evolved and changed our operating environment. And with that, I would say most people would agree policy has lagged behind. So you've got these rules that, Vinny was talking about really in terms of the operating code of conduct, the policies in place to define how technology and processes are implemented. And then you're talking about the benefits that Bob was alluding to, that should inherently come with that, but not everything has actually caught up. And as technologists, the best enterprise is the simplest enterprise, right? Because you're reducing risk. So what we're really kind of facilitating here is a set of operating principles, both at the policy level, the process level, and the technology level, to drive mission requirements and inherently reduce risk. And if you do that, an organization is going to really see nothing but upside. But there's a lot of cultural risk, associated with that. Now, I'll emphasize that that's a perceived risk. It's something that we found, and I'm sure Vinny could speak to, with his experience at the USDA, and we've seen within the DoD that once those perceptions are addressed adequately, and there's a comfort level that shifts with that cultural change, the acceptance of certain centralized concepts is tolerated and in fact embraced.
No, I love it, especially when you consider change control and things of that nature that get done and standardize the processes. So I love a lot of what you guys just talked about in terms of mitigating risk as it pertains to change or just standardization of process, right? So all right, so let's start to kind of transition as we look at, all right, now that we understand, all right, some of the reasons for doing it, let's talk about some of the things that are standing in the way of getting there, okay? So looking at, barriers, there's typically a number of barriers that kind of stand in the way. Bob, and starting with you, what are some of the things that you guys have seen at G2IT in terms of, standing in the way of quite frankly, whether it's, in some cases, change?
Yeah, so the change, what we see as the challenge with change is really how are you going to govern the future state process? How do I account for who's making the decisions on how to operate? Is leadership focusing on endorsing and empowering the position of the shared service or the controlled autonomous discussion? And is the funding going to support the long-term leadership of this? These transitions take years, not months. So you have to set a strategy and understand where you're going and have everyone in the organization across agencies agree to the commonality of the good and drive that forward. And also data model is very important also. You have to understand what is my framework of operating in the environment so I can share the data and have workflow flow, not only through humans, but through automated processes. The more you can define the data and understand the commonality of it, and everyone endorses and drives towards that outcome, you can then set yourself up for future automation, future improvement of leveraging the services available to everyone.
No, great. I love it. Right. So there are, there's typically a number of things standing in the way. You talk about defining kind of a long-term strategy. So, Sean, is as you guys see that at G2SF, anything to add to what Bob said? Bob spoke a lot to kind of creating that culture to it, right? And building off of that, especially kind of a long-term roadmap to get there. It's not a marathon, or it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Any thoughts there?
Sure, yeah, no, and I agree with Bob. I think you've got a couple of things that you really have to handle, and Bob certainly talked about the governance, right? So what are the policies that are going to govern the way we're going to operate? I think related to that, when you can put the policies in place, and I'm sure we all over our careers can think of policies that have been put in and maybe haven't been adhered to as well or as much as we might like. So you've got to address the culture of the agency and the culture of its subordinate commands or subordinate infrastructure, because they're going to drive the adoption and execution of that policy. Coupled with that, it's the legacy technology. These are the two things that I see, outside of the governance, the two additional things, if you will, that greatly impacts the success of this concept, and it frankly, it'll live or die with the people, because you can have the greatest technology, and you can have the best processes, and you can have the policy, but if the people don't adhere to it, you're dead in the water. So I think those are the two things to me, because there's a huge fight not only from a cultural standpoint, but when you look at the tech. Hey, I just bought this new whiz-bang tool, and we know that never happens in the government, that people don't flock to a sparkly item, but sometimes we do see in the enterprise that there might be a series of really great products that are duplicative in nature, and that's a sunk cost. That's an investment made. So now, how do we leverage that in this concept, right? And that's a real challenge. That takes some real thought on how to leverage what's been bought, spent, and yet drive towards this end objective.
Yeah, so what we start to get into and really delve into is whether that's tools or operational rationalization of things, right? And sometimes those are, is it safe to say that those are both cultural, people, technological, and operational challenges all kind of bundled into one there? So Vinny, your thoughts on the barriers to start down that road.
Yeah, John. And I think both panelists bring up a very common set of criteria that are typical barriers. As I was preparing for this conversation, I outlined three things that I'd like to talk about. One is people. I think we talked about that. There's a real, I won't say it's fear. It's a real lack of certainty. I think I put a parallel to this or a similarity to when automation, think about 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago when automation started taking place into enterprises. There's a lot of insecurity around adopting new ideas because either became a fear of job security or a fear of responsibility and visibility and ability to act onto your area of domain of expertise. But I think people is going to be really key. As we talk about this centralized autonomy, it's a thin line to kind of convey that centralized directives are okay but you have to have a feedback, right? And if you can make people comfortable in getting the feedback that what they say and what they're asking matters into the centralized autonomy, then you have a win-win. The other piece I found also working with federal agencies in this type of model is process agility. How often have we all met? We had discussed, we love this idea, love this concept, but it doesn't fit into an existing process. And as we all know, processes in federal government takes a while to change, right? It's a long journey, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think that the last piece is a challenge around organizational authority versus how budgets are allocated. Now, we talked about this briefly. Is it's when you talk about having some shiny new capability that has a lot of benefits to a lot of missions, sometimes you can present, but you can't force because the budget and the buying authority sits within a different line of business, doesn't sit at the CIO office, right? And so that those three things are areas I found are barriers that we have to have patience, you have to work through, and you have to just educate people around why the benefits are great for the organization.
So let's, I mean, and just, anyone feel free to chime in on this, right? So what we start to talk about there, and it is evangelization across a number of different areas, right? So I love that aspect of it. It's certainly a barrier, especially within, within federal government, of it doesn't fit into a, maybe it's round hole, square peg kind of thing. But how important is it then? I mean, as we consider, the barrier standing in the way to, evangelizing, and who owns that, right? Is that, who really has to own that in some of these groups? What do you guys think on that?
I'll add one thing here, Sean. Just to continue what I was mentioning, I think there's a responsibility on both sides, right? There is, the motto of, if you build it, they will come. You have to continue to prototype. You have to continue to show what is possible. But at the same time, you're going to have from an authority perspective, to also drive some pursuits and initiatives to make this happen. What do you think, Sean?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Vinny. I mean, I think in my experience, we've kind of seen the most effective way to affect the change really is to have some kind of executive level sponsorship. So that's kind of in that centralized spot, and that's got to be somebody, either a flag, an SES, but somebody who has got the ability to enforce what Bob was talking about, the governance and the policy, and can kind of make that call to that wayward command, that wayward organization, and say, hey, what are you doing? Politely ask that question to make sure that they understand their indivisibility. But then there's the boots on the ground. You've got to have that somebody who's got that operational mission focus, that's accepting this, and then you kind of bridge the gap, in my opinion, and you hope that through leading by example, the other organizations commit, right? They get on board, they and the other executive leadership, whether it's the colonels, the 15s, additional SESs, they're beginning to see, and with that, they see the change, they see the benefits, they see the risk reduction, they see the more effective execution of mission, and the byproduct, hopefully when that occurs, is you create a groundswell, and we've seen that, in some of our DoD customers, but as Bob pointed out earlier, it's a marathon, not a sprint. For one of our DoD customers, we're going into our 11th year. Right, and I'd say we're at a true enterprise, kind of working towards that centralized perspective and autonomous decision making. But it took a long time to get to this point, and it's a solid validation of Bob's perspective. I don't know what you have to say on it, Bob.
Yeah, and let's assume we have the leadership and you have the budget and you have a sort of high-level governance. The boots on the ground, as Vinny said, is really important. And one of the ways we see the value there is to provide some quick prototypes, quick hits, and to make change effective. You want to garner, with any change, there's about 25% of people that want to go there and are enthusiastic. There's about 50% of the people that are sort of sitting in the middle, waiting to see where the change ends up. And there's 25% that don't want anything to change. So really what we see is you work with the 25% to be your champions, and you really show them how the product or how the solutions can work, how the improved automation or whatever you're targeting for your initiatives are going to work. you get them very confident. They start talking at the boots on the ground level. This is good. This is going to work. You start to get those early successes. And then the 50%, which is your big group in the middle, starts to come along because they see the success starting to happen. So organizational change is more of an art. You need the leadership, you need the governance to push it, but you need to convert people almost one at a time on the ground to say, this is better than what I had before. I like going here. So that's the art of organizational change at the ground level, in addition to that leadership and governance push to make sure it's happening.
Yeah, John, I could add one thing.
Yeah.
If I could add one thing around what Bob is mentioning, one of the things I noted down here that we keep talking about is communication. In this new term, one of the things that we found is also you almost have to think about as a marketer, right? You have to think about how can you consistently and continuously communicate effectively the benefits of centralized autonomy. And that's where the boots on the ground, I think, as Sean mentioned, is very valuable. But you got to communicate, you got to market, and you got to solicit the feedback, because that this centralized autonomy doesn't work, in my opinion, if you don't have feedback loop to put back into your mission.
Yeah, I love that. I love that statement, and tying back to essentially the benefit of the mission is, and you guys are talking a lot about creating change agents and having others draft behind them, which makes a lot of sense. But while maintaining someone that's got to have essentially some of the vision and some of the ability to, for lack of a better word, strengthen that vision and evangelize that, right? So, all right. So, in looking at organizations that you've all worked with, and we see it all the time, they may be looking at that today, and there's change agents out there that are looking at it and saying, I'm in various stages of their own maturity continuum, saying, all right, I'm at step A, and how do I get over to EFG? So as we look at that, sometimes that can be somewhat overwhelming, right? And that can often lend itself to, apathy to a degree, right? And we all have seen that, right? So as organizations and certain folks are looking at things and saying, all right, what are the considerations to think about? What are some of the ways that I can begin this journey? What are some ways that, we were just talking about change agents, and then, people saying and looking, hey, what's happening over here? Let's go take a look. What are some of the considerations or and we'll start with go back to you, Sean, a little bit on, what do you think in terms of how do you get some wins on the scoreboard? What are some of the things to think about? How do they start this journey?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's the big question, right? I mean, that's the winner chicken dinner. I think it's different for every customer, and not because every customer is per se different, but they're all different in where they are in degrees of implementation, process maturity, and technology, right? There's some fundamental base similarities, but I think you have to look at, or our perspective is, and we're right now actually out at one of the combatant commands going through this very exercise, right? Creating kind of this roadmap, if you will, to achieve success. And so the first part, and it's a little cliche now, in terms of baselining or analysis or assessments, right? If you say that in the wrong circles, you could get shot or dropped. But there's some fundamental, some truth to you don't know where you want to go, if you don't know where you are, and you sure have a hard time getting there if you have no idea where you are. So you've got to establish where you are, right? In terms of appetite for the organization to do, as both you and Bob were talking about, change, right? Because if the organization, if you've got one sponsor, boots on the ground, or at the executive level, you've got to change your approach, right? Because you've got to leverage what you have. Perhaps you've already got technology, an enterprise platform system like Helix, which is being used. Okay, so that's great. That's only one component of the enterprise, and it's really only addressing, a series of processes, perhaps, maybe not all of them, but that's a point to begin. Maybe you don't have the technology, but you put in place the enterprise processes. So, this is a tough answer, but it really does depend, and you need to bring in the right people to determine where the organization is in order to get to that next step. And then the quick wins that you ask for are derivatives of that. You want something tangible and actionable, right? That everyone can get on board and say, well, from a discovery standpoint, I'm not saying we only have one discovery tool, but perhaps we can aggregate discovered information, so now people have visibility into that thing called the CMDB, right? So right there, we've just laid a great foundation for things, and pretty much anyone in the organization is going to say, if I didn't have that before and now I do, that's a measurable improvement, right? So that's kind of the segue into, I think metrics and how you want to measure improvement must be defined and accepted by the organization, and that's how you shape your quick wins. It's a little bit of highfalutin pie in the sky, I know, but it's the ground truth in terms of hitting operational excellence. If you can't do that, nothing else is going to happen. That's just, I got 20 years of challenges in my background to say, trust me on this. If we can't get the metrics in agreement for these little things, we're not going to get there, right? And I don't want to waste their time.
No, I mean, you bring up, I think, some really, fair and just points, because you're talking about a number of different things, right, Vinny, around, do you start from some foundational things? Do you start from what the end in mind is, right? Do you start from, hey, I think there's a real benefit to doing this. Who are the people that I need to change opinions to? Some of those kind of things. So you're touching on a number of different areas as you look at considerations of, and all essentially kind of tying back to some of the what is it that we're trying to address? What is the end in mind here? Where do we want to be? And then, almost, essentially assessing that or measuring that, and there's going to be some things that break down as a result of that. So, Vinny, what are your thoughts on, a number of different areas that we're talking about as organizations look to begin that journey, and starting there, and there's some foundational pieces certainly that Sean just touched on quite a bit. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think the big thing that we all have to realize is that the federal government looks upon us to be trusted advisors, right? And what does a trusted advisor mean? It means telling them and advising them, obviously in an eloquent way, when to do and when not to do things based on our experience. Like Sean mentioned, we all have collectively a lot of, keyboard time and time on the street around learning what works and what doesn't work. And I took a couple of bullet points that I felt are important for agencies who are listening to this to think about. How do they start? Absolutely do not try to solve the world's problem. Do not try to boil the ocean, right? There's a term that I learned from a good friend of mine around failing fast. Don't be afraid of that. Fail fast is a great methodology, especially when what we typically do, you wrap around an agile methodology for how you are collecting requirements, to prioritizing requirements, vetting them with your executive sponsor, vetting them with your customer, applying them, and then you collect and you assess. Was it successful? And do it fast. Do it within days, weeks. And one of the big things around the agencies that prevent that agility also comes down to contracting, right? You want to be able to measure your contract performance. You want to be able to provide feedback to your contractors and your customers. Is it working? Is it not working? Are there barriers? Can we make changes to improve that so that federal agencies can buy from industry and get what they want at the right time? So I'm always big from a contract perspective. And then the last piece, talking about the fail fast methodology, lean forward, disrupt. I think, in federal government, we always look at federal government as the stable boat, right? It's always going in a trajectory that changes slowly. And that's okay, but don't be afraid of introducing new thoughts, new ideas. You're looking at technologies. There's so many options for federal agencies to evaluate and to assess with minimal risk. What does cloud mean to me? Do I really understand the shared responsibility model around risk and security, right? Work with your industry partners to understand. And then last but not least, technology choices. We talked about BMC Helix. SaaS, is something that it's been a slow uptick and adoption with the federal government. But you look in the past year, maybe two, the procurements have come out for SaaS-based services, especially those that have a very low level of risk to entry. They're highly secure. They're accredited for your organization up to the highest levels for you to do things like measure your cloud costs, cloud spend, measure your cloud security. We talked about previous customer. We leverage Helix Cloud Security to provide real insight before information security was even aware, right? So those are the kind of things I always like to lean forward, because it drives that organizational change. It drives people to think about what's possible, and then you tune back, right? You kind of find the middle ground of what is acceptable within your agency.
No, I love it, and some of the things both of you are talking about is winning, assessing, and measuring in a way that's quick and agile. And I think one of the things, Vinny, you just said that it's really interesting around boiling the ocean. We see a lot of large projects sometimes that for whatever reason never really get kind of the fulfillment that they have. So probably, as we talked about, change agents before, and then others drafting behind them, and seeing the benefit that they're getting. It's an interesting journey that as we look at the ways to impact and have change, right? Especially within federal, especially given the fact of some of these folks, whether they may transition, or in the DoD side they may PCS to another duty station. Those kind of things are all impactful to this, right? So, Bob, is coming to you here. Is what are your thoughts on what we've talked about here a little bit, as far as the journey and the considerations?
Yeah, so what we find most successful is really getting in a room with your stakeholders that want improvement. And usually the way they express that is in problems of the day. I don't understand how well we're delivering service. I can't see what my organization's doing. I can't see how well I'm delivering to my stakeholders who are paying me or wanting to see that outcome. Mm-hmm. And what we try to do is sit down and say, let's lay out a quarterly discussion and try to get a strategy of, okay, if you can't do everything, you can't boil the ocean, what are the most important things for you to do? And I'll give you a couple examples. I've worked in a couple large organizations where they say, my service catalog has 450 items, and I've done 90,000 requests in the last year. And you say, okay, well, how many of those are your most used services? And they can't answer you. And so we did a little bit of analysis on one customer site like that, and the top 20 requests of 435 in a catalog delivered 2/3 of the requests all year long. So the question is, why don't you focus on the 20 that deliver 2/3 of your business, and then decide on how can I do that, in what order, on a quarter by quarter basis, and then how do I shift left? Self-service is a big thing for everybody. How do I shift left and let people understand how they can deliver services with minimal interaction, or you can automate them to execute the work? But the point being, every quarter, set some realistic goals. Say, if I could just do these two things, that would let me do these other two things, which is the next step and the next step and the next step. And after 2 years of quarters, you can say, I've adopted this change, I've gotten good at it, I measured it, and I'm moving to the next. I'm moving to the next. There's not a question on how am I maturing my organization in a very quantitative and qualitative way every quarter, because you're checking those things, as Vinny said, to understand, are you making headway against your baseline?
I like that a lot. Right?
To me, that is where
that looking at it?
That's where I've seen the most.
Hey, you're going in and it turns into kind of a whiteboard session, and hey, let's list out the areas that we're not happy with, and then prioritizing. Do you find that you start from foundational items? I think Sean was before talking a little bit about kind of like blind spot detection and relationship mapping with discovery and things like that. Do you find yourself starting with some of the foundational aspects, Bob?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you think of discovery is always a good one, right? Everybody says, I need to know what I have, or I need to discover, and I want service models. Everybody wants to say, what's my impact of these things as I change? How does it impact? Well, we all I don't say we all know. The way you do that is you get your inventory from discovery, you understand how they connect to each other through dependency, then you move it into your central database, and you use that to say, I understand how everything's connected. So when I do anything, I know how it's going to affect the environment. That's a long process. And people will say, I can't even get good inventory data. So you have to sort of focus on, well, where is the process or the data or the people processes not servicing the data quality? Because if you're pulling data into your central database and nobody trusts it, you'll never get to the next stage, which is I have a good service model impact that we all believe in. So you have to step very slowly, methodically, and say, am I getting good data out of the process I'm executing so I can build on it for the next stage? So you're absolutely right, John. What's the foundational aspects? Am I doing it well? Does everybody know their job, know the process? And then I can leverage that to make the next step up in my maturity. So you absolutely have to do it in a way that you can understand, am I getting better? And that gets back to Vinny's point of measuring the metrics as you go.
No, I love it. I love it. Any other thoughts, gangs? Before I think it's a real healthy discussion. I love some of the comments on how we start that journey and some of the things to really think about. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, John, I have one kind of, I guess, more tactical comment, and one of the things that we see, and it's probably, I would say Vinny and Bob do as well, and I'm sure, John, you've seen in your career, there's investments made in technology, sometimes mandated. So whether we're talking, DHS type CDM, or big DoD says you're going to use, XYZ, Tanium, etc. That happens every couple of years. Things get mandated, and we see that technology deployed, whether it's at the agency or the COCOM or what have you, but it's not leveraged to its full potential, right? And so when we think about opportunities for that quick win, I think Vinny pointed it out very early in our discussion. There's a lot of great technology out there now, and technology isn't the weak link anymore. And that's not to say that people are, and it's not to say the organization is, but people are focused on the mission and they lose sight, of what else is there and what else is going on. So the op tempo distracts them from helping, reach their objectives in an effective, more efficient way. I can't tell you how many times we've come in and we've seen, tool sets that are not fully leveraged. And the byproduct of that is, it's kind of going to like what Bob was talking about, in terms of discovery and dependency mapping, et cetera. Well, the tool's broken. It might not be deployed optimally. It might not be configured, or this is the harsh reality that sometimes people get that painful look in the mirror when we come in and say you might not be using it appropriately, right? And so that's the first quick win is self-actualization. Okay, I've got these tools. They may have been forced on me from this component of centralized autonomy, centralized decision making, if you will. But now, how do I use them to my benefit? SCCM, from a discovery standpoint, integrated into the CMDB and mapped, to people, to the organization, etc. There's a lot of examples where we have tools that are deployed. Active Directory, how is it being leveraged from an authoritative data source for people? We have these examples where the technology is there, but perhaps the knowledge, the intent, or it's on the to-do list. We see this a lot. I want to get there. I want to do these things, but I'm so wrapped up, in the operational tempo to deliver on the mission. I just can't move the needle on these advancements with what I have. Vinny, I don't know what you're saying.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, Sean.
So is that where, when one of the things we were just talking about, and I think both Bob and Vinny talked about it a little bit, is defining what success is, right? Is that a critical piece, and then having an operational rhythm where we're revisiting, okay, the overall vision and where you want to go? Is that of critical importance with these organizations as we look at moving to, centralized autonomy? I mean, is that a critical piece of this, or as Sean was just kind of saying, do we get lost in the weeds of the day to day? That certainly we're all, everyone is nobody's immune to that, right?
Yeah, centralized autonomy, in my opinion, does not work if you don't have the communication and a set of expectations on what the success expectation, either centrally or from each autonomous units, business units, organizations, agencies, right? You have to communicate what is your criteria for success, and then both sides. I mean, you have to evolve into a cooperating, functioning agency in the way that you can pick, adopt, reason the technology choices, and also implementation and consumption tactics.
Love it.
Yeah, and
Love
John, that was the point I was making about the quarterly strategy. You need to step back every quarter and say, are we making goals and strides to where we wanted to be? And is technology, our process, our policies changing? Because that's when you take your adjustment and you sort of step back and say, is the forest growing all the trees I wanted? Or do I have to adjust my way of looking at the forest now? But if you never step back, you get lost in that daily operational activity to get something done. And you might be missing things if you don't step back occasionally. And I recommend quarterly to say, has the world changed? Do we have to adjust our strategy? But you continue forward with the original thought.
Yep. Love it. Right. So coming up, as I think we close on this, we talked a lot of, covered a number of different areas on this topic, and there are a number of different, I think, benefits and obvious areas to really achieve and grow. I think where we've centered on is, certainly there's got to be a vision there, but then clear lines of what is it that you're trying to measure and where you're trying to go, and consistency to that with a set of optics around an operational rhythm of a review of that, right? And I love the analogy, Bob, but I think that's a perfect point to say, hey, do I need to look at the forest differently? It's perfect. So because it is a changing landscape, and whether it's operational or technology. So I want to thank all of you guys, Bob, Sean and Vinny. I appreciate, thank you for joining us here today. And for those of you joining us, virtually, any questions or comments, please refer to the listed contact information. Again, I'm John Powers with BMC, and thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.